a party guest who overheard the heated exchange between Evelyn and Mason during the gender reveal party and later reported it to authorities. In June 2013, the body of 44-year-old David Harper was discovered in the backyard of his home in Blue Creek, Texas. An investigation uncovered the shocking secrets behind his murder, unraveling the tangled web of betrayal between his wife Evelyn Harper and his brother Mason. In January 2013, a series of events began at the Harper estate that would ultimately lead to a tragedy that shook the small town to its core. On the warm morning of June 6, 2013, Blue Creek, Texas, stirred under a golden sunrise that painted its small town charm in a light many had grown used to over the years. But by mid-morning, the peaceful facade was shattered. At 10:14 a.m., a frantic 911 call came from Margaret Tillman, a neighbor of the Harpers. Her voice, usually calm and measured, trembled as she described what she had seen in the backyard of the Harper residence, a body lying face down in the grass, lifeless, and surrounded by a growing pool of blood. The Harper home, known in town for its sprawling ranch-style architecture and pristine landscaping, was no longer a symbol of suburban perfection. Police officers arrived within minutes, the flashing lights of their patrol cars cutting through the quiet neighborhood. The scene was gruesome. David Harper, a 44-year-old real estate developer who had built his life on precision and control, lay crumpled on the ground near the patio. His body bore signs of a brutal attack. His face was barely recognizable, battered with such force that even seasoned officers had to look away. Beside him, fragments of a shattered glass bottle glistened in the sunlight, the jagged edges stained with blood. The officers immediately cordoned off the area, securing the property as crime scene investigators were called in. The backyard, once a place of celebration just 2 days prior, now felt suffocating, as though the horror of the moment had tainted the air. The white and blue balloons tied to the patio railing, left over from the recent gender reveal party, swayed lightly in the breeze, their cheerful presence now an unsettling contrast to the violence. As investigators combed through the scene, they found faint footprints in the damp grass leading away from the body and toward the side gate. The prints seemed hurried, uneven, as if the person leaving had been in a frenzy. By 1 p.m., David's body was taken to the medical examiner's office, but the mystery surrounding his death was just beginning to unravel. Word of the murder spread quickly through Blue Creek, a town where everyone knew everyone. Residents whispered about the shocking crime, their voices filled with both fear and intrigue. Many recalled the Harper gender reveal party just 2 nights before, on June 4th, an extravagant event that had brought together friends, family, and colleagues. The party had been the talk of the town even before the murder, a testament to the Harper family's wealth and influence. Now, it became the focal point of the investigation. Detective Laura Monroe and her partner, Carlos Vega, arrived on the scene in the early afternoon. Laura, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for being relentless, immediately zeroed in on the broken glass bottle. Its placement near the body and the sheer brutality of the attack suggested a personal motive. Carlos, known for his sharp instincts, scanned the backyard, his eyes narrowing as he noticed faint blood smears on the patio door handle. By the evening of June 6th, the detectives began interviewing the Harpers' neighbors. Margaret Tillman, The neighbor who had discovered the body mentioned hearing raised voices coming from the Harper residence late on the night of the party. She had dismissed it at the time, assuming it was a harmless argument, perhaps fueled by too much wine. Another neighbor, Stephen McCarthy, revealed seeing Mason Harper, David's younger brother, leaving the property in the early hours of June 5th, his walk unsteady and his face unusually tense. Detectives Laura and Carlos turned their attention to the events of the gender reveal party itself. Guests who had attended described a lavish celebration filled with laughter and lighthearted moments, but some also recalled undercurrents of tension. Evelyn Harper, David's wife, had seemed unusually quiet for most of the evening, her expression strained even as she smiled for photos. Mason Harper, on the other hand, had been loud and unrestrained, drinking heavily and drawing attention with his erratic behavior. By June 8th, as more witnesses were questioned, the story began to take shape. One guest mentioned overhearing a heated exchange between David and Evelyn during the party. The argument had been brief, but sharp, with David walking away visibly upset while Evelyn stood frozen, her hands trembling as she clutched her glass. Others noted that Mason had been unusually attentive to Evelyn, his lingering glances and protective demeanor raising eyebrows. The detectives also learned that the gender reveal had marked more than just the announcement of a baby. For the Harpers, it was supposed to signal a fresh start. David had made it a point to publicly promise Evelyn that he would cut back on work and prioritize their family. It was a gesture that many saw as heartfelt, but for those who knew the couple well, it felt forced. Like a man trying to repair cracks in a foundation that was already crumbling. By June 10th, the detectives had pieced together enough information to see the outlines of a darker narrative. Evelyn Harper's subdued demeanor at the party and Mason Harper's erratic behavior pointed to secrets hidden beneath the surface of the Harper family. Witness testimonies, coupled with forensic evidence from the crime scene, further implicated the two. The glass bottle fragments found near David's body revealed not only his blood, but also fingerprints belonging to both Evelyn and Mason. The investigation turned its focus on the Harper family dynamics. David Harper had built an empire, but his success came at the cost of personal relationships. His wife, Evelyn, had grown increasingly distant over the years, her unhappiness masked by her polished exterior. Mason, the younger brother, had always lived in David's shadow, struggling with feelings of inadequacy and resentment. By June 20th, the evidence reached a breaking point. Evelyn Harper and Mason Harper were both arrested in connection with David's murder. The town of Blue Creek, still reeling from the initial shock of the crime, now found itself grappling with the scandalous revelations that followed. What had started as a joyous celebration of new life had unraveled into a tragic tale of betrayal and violence, leaving the residents of Blue Creek to wonder what secrets might still lie hidden beneath the surface. Evelyn Harper's life, to the outside world, seemed nothing short of idyllic. By 2013, she was 34 years old and living the dream many small-town girls aspired to. Her husband, David Harper, was a self-made real estate mogul, 10 years her senior. Their marriage, 8 years strong, was celebrated with admiration in the small community of Blue Creek. Evelyn was often the hostess of elegant parties, the face of a seemingly perfect life. But the truth was far from the polished image she presented. Evelyn felt trapped. Beneath the surface, she battled deep dissatisfaction and a growing sense of resentment toward David. The love they had shared in the early years of their marriage had faded, replaced by a cold distance. David, ever the perfectionist, had poured his energy into building his real estate empire, neglecting the emotional needs of their relationship. His relentless pursuit of success left Evelyn feeling like an accessory in her own life, a trophy wife meant to adorn the home he so meticulously curated but never truly lived in. The pregnancy, announced earlier that year, had been a ray of hope for the couple. For David, it was a chance to build a family legacy. For Evelyn, it was a lifeline, something to hold on to in a marriage that was slipping away. But as her pregnancy progressed, Evelyn realized the distance between her and David was not closing. The life growing inside her only deepened the emptiness she felt, an irony that gnawed at her daily. David's younger brother, Mason Harper, was everything David was not. At 29, Mason was impulsive, reckless, and completely unpredictable. He was the kind of man who lived on the fringes of respectability, drifting from one failed project to the next, while nursing a drinking problem and carrying the weight of a troubled past. His strained relationship with David was no secret. David often saw Mason as a liability, someone who tarnished the Harper name. Mason, in turn, resented David's success and his ability to always come out on top. Despite Mason's flaws, or perhaps because of them, Evelyn was drawn to him. Their affair began innocently enough, born out of shared frustrations. Evelyn saw in Mason the passion and spontaneity that had long disappeared from her marriage. Mason, perpetually living in his brother's shadow, found validation in Evelyn's attention. Over time, their connection deepened into a dangerous, magnetic bond fueled by resentment and desire. The tension in their secret relationship reached its peak on June 4th, 2013, the day of the grand gender reveal party. The event was supposed to be a celebration of new beginnings, a way to bring family and friends together. The Harper estate was transformed into a scene of opulence. White tents adorned the backyard, tables were laden with expensive hors d'oeuvres, and a live band played soft melodies as guests sipped on champagne. Fireworks were planned for the evening, culminating in the reveal of the baby's gender. For David, this was an opportunity to showcase not just his wealth, but his devotion to Evelyn and their unborn child. Evelyn, dressed in an elegant pastel gown, played her part perfectly. She smiled and laughed with the guests, gracefully accepting their congratulations. But inside, she was crumbling. Her discomfort grew as the day wore on, heightened by Mason's presence. Mason had arrived late, already slightly drunk. His dark charisma and brooding demeanor were impossible to ignore, and Evelyn couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on her. As the evening progressed, the tension became palpable. When it was time for David's toast, he raised his glass high and spoke with unusual emotion. He promised to step back from work, to dedicate himself fully to their growing family. His words were met with applause, but not everyone was moved. Mason, standing at the edge of the crowd, scoffed audibly, drawing uneasy laughter from some of the guests. Evelyn's cheeks burned with embarrassment, her mind racing with anxiety. Shortly after, she excused herself under the guise of needing a moment alone. But Mason followed her. In the quiet of the kitchen, emotions boiled over. Their conversation turned heated, charged with anger and longing. Mason accused Evelyn of playing along with David's charade, while she begged him to keep his emotions in check. Unbeknownst to them, a guest had wandered into the kitchen, searching for another bottle of wine. What they overheard, a declaration of love from Mason and Evelyn's panicked attempts to silence him, sent shock waves through the evening. The guest left without confronting them, but later shared what they had heard with David. By the end of the night, David's world was beginning to crack, though he kept his composure in front of his guests. In the early hours of June 5th, the Harper household was anything but quiet. After the last guest had left, David confronted Evelyn. What began as a quiet conversation turned into a heated argument. Evelyn denied the affair at first, clinging to the hope that she could salvage the situation. But David's anger was unrelenting. His voice grew louder, his words sharper, until Evelyn could no longer deny the truth. At some point, Mason, still intoxicated and lingering in the guest house, intervened. Fueled by alcohol and years of pent-up resentment, he lashed out at David, hurling accusations of neglect and hypocrisy. David, unwilling to back down, pushed back, escalating the argument into a physical altercation. Evelyn, caught in the middle, watched in horror as the two men she cared about most turned on each other. Around 2 a.m., the violence reached its breaking point. Mason grabbed a glass bottle from the patio table and swung it with all his strength, striking David across the face. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the backyard. David collapsed, blood pouring from his wounds as he gasped for air. Evelyn screamed, frozen in disbelief, as Mason stood over his brother, the shattered bottle still clutched in his hand. In the minutes that followed, panic set in. Evelyn and Mason worked together to stage the scene, wiping their fingerprints from the bottle and attempting to clean the blood spatter. Evelyn changed out of her blood-stained dress, stuffing it into a garbage bag, while Mason paced the yard, his mind racing with ways to cover their tracks. In their haste, they overlooked small details: droplets of blood on Evelyn's discarded dress, Mason's shoe prints in the wet grass. As the first hints of dawn broke over Blue Creek, the Harper estate fell silent once more. But the damage had been done, and the truth would soon come to light. The investigation into David Harper's brutal murder moved swiftly, powered by the urgency of the case and the shocking revelations that emerged with every passing day. By June the 7th, 2013, the Harper residence had transformed into a hub of activity. Police cars lined the driveway, and forensic teams worked tirelessly to piece together the events of the tragic night. What seemed at first like a tragic accident, an inebriated fall, quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. The first major breakthrough came with the guest who had attended the gender reveal party. By June 8th, this guest, who had initially been hesitant to come forward, contacted the authorities. They recounted what they had overheard during the party: a tense exchange between Evelyn Harper and Mason Harper in the kitchen. The words they remembered were enough to send shivers down the spines of the detectives. It painted a picture of an affair that had spiraled out of control. The detectives began to re-examine the dynamics of the Harper family, realizing that the key to solving the case lay in unraveling the relationships between the victim, his wife, and his brother. Forensic evidence soon added weight to the testimony. By June 12th, investigators had analyzed the broken glass bottle found near David's body. Microscopic traces of Evelyn's blood were detected on the jagged edges, an unusual discovery given that David's injuries were caused by blunt force trauma. This clue hinted that Evelyn had been present during the struggle. Additionally, Mason's muddy shoe prints were found leading away from the scene, their chaotic pattern suggesting a panicked flight. These physical pieces of evidence painted a clearer picture of the crime, but left unanswered questions about who had struck the fatal blow. The detectives also uncovered digital evidence that shifted the investigation into high gear. By June 15th, they had accessed text message exchanges between Evelyn and Mason. The messages, filled with desperation and longing, revealed the depth of their affair. But one text stood out above the rest: Mason's chilling suggestion that they should finally get rid of David. While it was unclear if Evelyn had taken the statement seriously, its implications were damning. The detectives now had motive, opportunity, and a web of lies tying both suspects to the crime. The interrogations began on June 18, 2013, with Mason Harper. Mason, who had always been volatile, crumbled under pressure. Initially defiant, he maintained that he had no involvement in David's death. But as detectives presented him with the mounting evidence, the shoe prints, the text messages, and the guest's testimony, his composure cracked. Desperate to save himself, Mason shifted blame onto Evelyn. He claimed she had manipulated him, using her charm and their affair to convince him to act on her behalf. He painted her as a calculating mastermind who had wanted her husband gone for years. Evelyn, brought in for questioning the following day, presented a stark contrast to Mason. She arrived composed, dressed meticulously, despite the weight of the accusations against her. But her calm exterior began to fracture as detectives probed deeper. When confronted with Mason's statements, Evelyn's initial denial gave way to anger. She accused Mason of being unstable and irrational, a man whose jealousy and recklessness had spiraled out of control. Their once passionate affair was now reduced to mutual accusations, each framing the other as the true instigator of David's murder. As the days went on, the investigators watched the emotional unraveling of two people who had once shared a bond built on secrecy and betrayal. Mason's anger turned to desperation, while Evelyn's poise crumbled into visible fear. By June 25th, both suspects had implicated each other to such an extent that the detectives could see the layers of their lies clearly. Each had hoped to use the other as a shield, but their tangled web of deception only served to tighten the noose around them both. By March 2015, after nearly 2 years of legal battles and delays, the trial of Evelyn and Mason Harper began in a packed courthouse. The case had gripped the small town of Blue Creek, and the courtroom overflowed with spectators eager to see how the drama would unfold. The prosecution's case was meticulous. They painted Evelyn as a woman who had grown resentful of her husband's success and distant affection, turning to Mason for solace. But this solace, they argued, quickly morphed into something darker. Using the text messages as evidence, the prosecution showed that Evelyn and Mason had both discussed removing David from their lives. The damning forensic evidence, the blood-stained bottle, the footprints, and the timeline of events made it clear that both suspects were at the scene of the crime. Mason's defense hinged on impulsivity. His lawyers argued that the murder had been a drunken accident, an unplanned act of violence that Mason deeply regretted. They portrayed him as a troubled man who had been swept up in Evelyn's manipulative schemes. Evelyn's defense team, on the other hand, sought to distance her from the actual murder, claiming that Mason alone had acted out of jealousy and rage. They painted Evelyn as a victim, trapped in an unhappy marriage and manipulated by a dangerous lover. The trial's most emotional moments came during the testimony of character witnesses. Friends of David spoke of his generosity and dedication to his family, contrasting sharply with the cold and calculated image of Evelyn that the prosecution presented. Mason's former friends described a man who had always been volatile but never violent, adding complexity to his role in the crime. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict on March 25, 2015. Mason Harper was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read, the weight of his actions finally catching up with him. Evelyn Harper was found guilty of manslaughter. Despite her defense team's efforts, the jury could not overlook her role in the events leading to David's death. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The sentencing brought mixed reactions from the community. Some felt Evelyn's punishment was too lenient, given the betrayal and deception that had led to the murder. Others believed she had suffered enough, losing her husband, her lover, and her freedom in one devastating series of events. Mason, meanwhile, became a symbol of unchecked jealousy and the destructive power of resentment. Blue Creek, Texas, a town that once prided itself on its quiet streets and tight-knit community, would never be the same after the Harper case. The murder of David Harper, followed by the sensational trial of his wife Evelyn and brother Mason, turned the town into a hub of curiosity and whispers. By 2015, the case had become infamous. The details dissected in hushed tones at church gatherings, in grocery store aisles, and across kitchen tables. The Harper name, once associated with success and prosperity, became a symbol of betrayal, scandal, and tragedy. David Harper's estate, a sprawling property with its manicured lawns and luxurious interiors, became a haunting reminder of the events that had unfolded there. The house, once the pride of the community, was sold by October 2015. The proceeds from the sale were given to David's estranged sister, Susan Harper, a quiet and unassuming woman who had always lived in the shadow of her brother's larger-than-life personality. Susan had maintained her distance from the Harper family for years, her relationship with David strained by old family disputes. But in the aftermath of his death, she was the only one left to step forward. Susan, who had never married and lived modestly in a neighboring town, suddenly found herself thrust into a role she had never anticipated. Evelyn, sentenced to 20 years in prison, was 6 months pregnant when she began her sentence. With no immediate family willing to take responsibility, Susan became the guardian of the child Evelyn carried, a baby boy born in January 2016. The baby, named Nathaniel David Harper, became a beacon of hope in an otherwise dark chapter. Despite the circumstances of his birth, Susan was determined to give him a life untouched by the shadows of his parents' actions. She moved into a small, unassuming home far from Blue Creek, hoping to shield Nathaniel from the weight of his family's legacy. But even as she tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy, the questions lingered. Would the boy grow up to understand the complexity of his family's history? Could he escape the reputation that had attached itself to the Harper name? By 2018, the Harper case was no longer front-page news, but its echoes still lingered in Blue Creek. The house, now under new ownership, stood as a silent witness to the events that had once gripped the town. People would sometimes drive past, pointing out the property to visitors as if recounting a ghost story. "That's where it happened," they would say, their voices tinged with both fascination and unease. For Susan, life moved on quietly. She poured all her energy into raising Nathaniel, who grew into a curious and bright child. She avoided discussions of his parents, choosing instead to focus on the future. But she couldn't avoid the reminders entirely. Every time Nathaniel smiled or laughed, there was a flicker of David in his expression. When he grew angry or frustrated, Susan sometimes saw traces of Evelyn's fiery temper. These moments, though fleeting, filled her with both hope and dread, a reminder that the past could never truly be erased. By 2020, Nathaniel was old enough to start asking questions. He noticed that other children had mothers who picked them up from school, attended soccer games, and kissed their foreheads at bedtime. He began to wonder why his own mother never came. Susan, who had prepared for this moment, sat him down one evening and began to tell him a carefully constructed version of the truth. She spoke of his father, a strong and successful man who had loved deeply, and his mother, a woman who had made mistakes, but loved him just as much. She avoided the darker details, knowing that one day he would seek them out on his own. Evelyn, still in prison, aged more rapidly than her years. By 2021, she was no longer the polished woman who had once hosted lavish parties at the Harper estate. Life behind bars had stripped her of the exterior she had worked so hard to maintain. But in her letters to Nathaniel, she held on to the hope that one day she might be forgiven, not just by her son, but by herself. She imagined a future where she could hold him again, where she could explain her actions and find redemption. Whether that future would ever come remained uncertain. In the end, the Harper legacy was not the wealth or success that David had worked so hard to build. It was the pain, the betrayal, and the small glimmer of hope carried by a boy who bore the weight of his family's past. Nathaniel Harper, though too young to understand the full extent of his history, represented a second chance, a hope that perhaps the sins of the past would not define the future. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates, and you can check out another insane case we have, the one where an Alabama wife exposes her husband's affair, with his half-sister ending in shock and murder. Make sure to check it out, and let us know what you think in the comments section.